Today, our guest is Michael Santos. He grew up in northern Seattle and began making a series of bad decisions in his teenage years. By the time he was 20, he was breaking the law by selling cocaine. DEA agents arrested Michael in 1987. After a jury convicted him, Judge Jack Tanner sentenced Michael to a 45-year prison sentence. While incarcerated prior to his sentencing, Michael made a commitment to work toward reconciling with society. His deliberate strategy required that he work to educate himself, contribute to society, and build himself a support network. That disciplined approach to serving time carried him through the 26 years that he served. He earned an undergraduate degree from Mercer University, a graduate degree from Hofstra University, and he published 7 books that have inspired tens of thousands while in prison. Michael concluded his obligation to the Bureau of Prisons on August 12, 2013. Since then, he worked to improve outcomes of our nation's criminal justice system while simultaneously working to build an investment career. He hosts podcasts and creates YouTube videos and writes extensively to teach and inspire others. He also served as a professor in numerous universities. Welcome to Yentas in the City, Michael. It is an honor to have you on our show. The Yentas literally know all the details of your life. The questions we will ask you are for our listeners because we read your book, Earning Freedom, Conquering a 45-Year Prison Term, and we were beyond captivated and became well-versed on your life. It is a compelling and inspiring book. We are proud to know you and call you our friend. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much. It's my honor to be on Yentas in the City, and it was great to meet you last week ago. I'm so happy to be here.
Michael, I can tell you one thing. When we started this, when we first, the initial introduction, I never thought when somebody, introduced me to you, I won't mention names here, I thought it's going to just be an interview. I'm going to go and read a book like we do normally. You inspired me so much that ever since I read your book, I cannot sleep at night. That's all I dream and breathe. And your story, it's just amazing. And obviously our listeners are going to see that right now. So let's start by, I would like you to please tell our listeners about your background, like what background did you come from, your early life as a child, and how you went to prison.
Sure. Yeah, I grew up in Seattle, Washington. I was born in California, but as a young boy, my parents moved to Seattle, Washington to build their life. My father is an immigrant, so I'm a first-generation American. He escaped from Cuba and met my mom here in Southern California. But by the time I was 3 or 4, our young family moved to Seattle, where I grew up, and that was home for me for many years. So he built a contracting company there in North Seattle, and I grew up working alongside of him, trying to, run a little bit too fast for what my parents wanted, what I was groomed to do, and I found myself getting into trouble as a young adolescent and as an older adolescent, really. By the time I was a teenager, I started making some really bad decisions, choosing some bad friends choosing some friends that we were young and getting into trouble. And that trouble included selling cocaine. That started when I was 20 years old. And when I was 23 years old, I was arrested for getting involved in that crime. And that's what put me on a long path to redemption.
Wow.
Wow. Michael, can you specifically take us back to that day when you were arrested and then when you were charged with an 848, which is the code for continuing criminal enterprise? You were convicted of being a kingpin. And I just want to say, before you tell us that, I found it so interesting in the book, on the day when you were released from prison, that day, the last day serving, you briefly say in the book that you looked up at the clock and it said it was 8:48 in the morning. And
Yeah.
you remembered by looking at the time, you said that was the code that I was charged with, this continuing criminal enterprise.
Well,
That was
I'm
like,
impressed that you would remember such an esoteric code.
I'm telling you, we were obsessed with
Michael, we remember I just want to tell you, we read the book and then we listened to you reading the book, the audio. And you know what? I even took notes, not even knowing that we'll end up starting a friendship and, we are still going to work together in the future. I just thought this is going to be an interview. So we don't just remember, we took notes. There is some saying that you said, and I'm like, oh my God, this is, I have to jot this down. I have to remember this. I have to remember that. It's fascinating.
So if we were in your college class, we would get an A.
Right.
Yes, we would have. And that was certainly a thrill for me to be able to get out of prison and then start teaching inside of a university, because I'd never stepped foot on a university before I went to prison. So it's kind of ironic that schools were such an important part of my adjustment through prison, and they helped me launch my career when I came home in August of 2013.
Wow. So, Karen, you wanted him to elaborate on the day that you got arrested, right, Karen?
Yeah, I wanted to know, after you were sentenced to 45 years in prison, you were sent to USP Atlanta, the high security prison in Atlanta. And I wanted to know if you could take our listeners back to what that was like in USP Atlanta, if you could guide us through a typical day. Our listeners should also know that during your 26 years served in prison, you were transferred approximately a dozen times, and you served in many prisons such as McKean, in Florence, Fort Dix.
Yeah, I'll tell you the whole journey.
Lompoc. So let's start with the day you got arrested.
Yeah.
So the day I got arrested was August 11th, 1987. And it was like I can tell you, before I got arrested, and I still remember, I felt nervous. I knew I had broken the law. I was trying to get my life back together. I was 23 years old, and I didn't like the state of my life at that time. And so I remember having these, nightmares that something was going to happen. And then, of course, it happened on August the 11th, 1987. I remember being inside of some type of a business transaction. I think I was visiting with a mortgage broker for a piece of property, and I remember a phone call and being told that there were police officers at my house, and I knew immediately, there were police officers, what they were there for. So I had like this brief window of time where I could think, what am I going to do? Because I didn't know what to do. I was young. I'd never known anybody who'd been arrested before. I couldn't tell my parents because I was embarrassed. And I just didn't have the maturity to really understand the gravity of problems that I had created for myself. But I eventually went home after a few hours, and the DE agents were there waiting for me, 3 of them. And I remember them pointing their guns right at my head, and telling me to stop. And then they put me in my hands behind my back and put me in handcuffs. And that was the start of my long journey of 9,500 days in federal prison.
So let's tell our listeners, you were married at a time when you sold drugs. You bought a lot of luxurious items, right? You lived in a very luxurious apartment with your then wife.
Yeah.
Right?
I was trying to cut her out of my narrative. Now that you brought her up, yeah, I was married at the time. I was 23 years old and living this life that,
Jet set life in Miami.
Yeah, Miami, young kid, wild kid,
a Porsche,
driving fancy cars or exotic cars and cigarette race boats and living on Key Biscayne and just being a very irresponsible young man.
Did your parents ever ask you, where are you getting all this money from?
Yes, but I deceived them all the time. And, I think they suspected, but I lied to them. And I was on a bad path at that time in my life, and was a disappointment, I know, to both of my parents. And I'm ashamed for the way that I had disappointed them and caused them so much heartache at that age. It was very difficult for both of them, because they had so much hope for me. My father immigrated to the United States with expectations of building a better life for our family. And as his only child, I owed him a lot more than what I delivered as a young man. I was just reckless and arrogant, and that those bad decisions that I made during the recklessness of youth caused a lot of harm to them. And I've been working ever since to atone.
Well, I just want to tell you that they should be very, very proud of you. I want to ask you, Michael, after you were sentenced to 45 years in prison, you asked God for strength, and you quickly started thinking about what you can control. Obviously, you're in prison, 23 years old. What can I control? What I cannot control? You realize that obviously you cannot control everything. You set a 10-year goal for yourself, which is very amazing for a 23-year-old who was just a troublemaker. You talk about 3 prongs in your book: getting an education, contributing to society, and building your support network. If you could please elaborate on the 3 prongs to us, because it's...
And boy, did you do all 3 of those.
Oh boy, did you.
Let me back up, because that brings to the question that I failed to answer, that Karen asked in the beginning about my first day at USP Atlanta. Because when I got to USP Atlanta, I was young, and it was a notoriously high security prison, notoriously violent, and I was afraid, and I needed strength. I had already made this decision while I was in jail to transform my life, but I remember that first day going to the library and looking to read of other people who had gone through struggle, because I thought that I could learn from them. And there wasn't a big library because there had been a riot at that prison and they burned it down. But I remember they had the Encyclopedia Britannica, and I started reading, looking for threads, and I found stories of survivors from the Holocaust. And that was my first exposure to Viktor Frankl and to Primo Levi and to so many other people that suffered in that world. And I remember saying to myself, finding hope and inspiration in their stories. And I remember reading that one of the ways that they found strength was by documenting and writing and serving others. And so that gave me a new path. And that path is really what inspired me to pursue those 3 prongs, Eddie, that you just described, is not thinking about where I was and what bad decisions I had made that brought me there, but rather think about what can I do with this experience to make amends and to reconcile. And that's how I came up with those 3 prongs, as I started to think about people like each of you and like people in your audience of if those people were ever going to see me as something different from the bad decisions that I made when I was 20, what would I have to do? What would they expect from me? And they became my beacons of hope that I could work toward if I could work toward earning my education and work toward developing services or products that would contribute to society and build a support network, then it might be possible to build a stronger support system. And I believe that would help me. And it did. And I was very fortunate.
And you really did build a great support network from inside prison. I mean, these were like amazing attorneys and professors from universities all across the country that really advocated for you.
And yeah, and I had an amazing experience in prison, and I've had a really charmed experience since getting out of prison. And it's all because I attribute it all to those decisions that I made, from lessons I learned from, people that suffered horrendous struggle. And there's always lessons. And what I learned, I think, is that all of us as human beings go through challenges and struggle, but there's always a pathway through. And my challenge was of my own making. Other people have challenges that are just by nature of society. So I consider it a gift to be able to share this with as many people as possible. And I thank the Yentas for giving me this opportunity.
I wanted to tell you that it's really funny because in men's search for meaning, and also the way we grew up, because we grew up with the Holocaust, always like you heard about it, people talked about it, grandparents. And I remember my grandparents always saying, one thing nobody could take from us was they took our dignity. They couldn't take what we have here. They couldn't take the education. They couldn't take our knowledge. And they kind of pushed us to go to college because they said when we were in there was one thing nobody can take from you, and that's what you have inside your head. And you literally lived by it in the way you survived prison. Another thing I want to tell you real quick is when you left, we met for lunch. I looked at Karen and I said, Karen, I have to ask you something. When we came to meet Michael, we came to meet a prisoner that was in prison for 26 years. And I was sitting, while we were talking to you, because you are so educated, you are so smart, really a very, very smart person. And we met a lot of smart people in our life, and you're brilliant. And I'm not just saying it. And I looked at her, I said, do you believe, if this guy just came to us and sat with us and talked, would you ever think that he was ever in prison? And she goes,
well,
no.
It's funny, but in the book, when you go to the camps like Lompoc and Atwater, the people didn't believe that you were in prison for so long. You just don't look the stereotypical part of what you would think a prisoner.
Well, that was a plan. It's funny. I go into prisons now and to try to teach and inspire other people in prison. That's one of my businesses, is to create courses and content that prisons buy for that specific purpose. But when I would go into prisons, the people would look at me and that's what they'd say. They'd say, that fool was never in prison. And they'll look at me and say,
let alone 45-year sentence.
No, but I'd say, you think you're giving me an insult because I don't look hard enough. And, but that was the plan, was to be able to come back unscathed and function in society as a law-abiding, contributing citizen and create jobs and live with dignity intact. And I would like to take credit for that, but it wouldn't be fair, because I learned those lessons from leaders who lived before me, and they inspired me. And now I simply try to live as the change I want to see in the world. As Gandhi said, I try to just be a good person. And every day I think I'm fortunate to be able to do that.
I have to go, before I go to the next question, actually your temperament, and because you don't look like the tough guy, actually helped you survive the prison system. Can you elaborate a little bit about that, since you mentioned it?
I think what helped me a great deal was understanding how I wanted to emerge. Since I knew that I wanted to come home and I didn't want to be a criminal, that influenced every decision that I made. So whenever we face a challenge, I think that's a pattern that we all have to pursue, is to start by defining the best possible outcome. What is it that you want? And I knew what I wanted. I wanted to walk into society and be able to put on a suit and tie, and nobody would know that I served a day in prison unless I told them. That was my goal.
No one would know.
Well, right.
So that would influence then the way that I spent my day, what books I would read, what friends I would choose, which job I would maneuver my way into, and all of my time. And so
look where you ended up with the Yentas.
Yeah, and that brought me to the Yentas in the city.
Right. We must shift our focus for a moment, my favorite part about your life, and discuss the matter of the heart. At the time when you were sentenced to prison, you were married, but once in prison, your relationship came to an end. But about 15 years ago, into your prison sentence, you received a letter which changed your life. By the way, the only thing that we think is greater than you is what you're going to discuss right now.
Yes, I'm very fortunate.
So talk to us, Michael. Tell.
So yes, you're right. After I got to the prison, and I was fortunate to be able to find these pathways that would influence my adjustment. It led to my getting an undergraduate degree, as you said, a master's degree. I became an author and publishing, and that led to a strong support group. And one of those people is Carol. Now, Carol, to me, is very special. She's the center of my life, but at the time I didn't know that. I knew that, but she didn't know that. We knew each other when we were children, but I was on the wild side, and she was a good girl and wasn't close to me or my friend at that time. But even as a young boy, I knew that someday she would be my girl, or at least that's what I like to tell myself. And so I met her because I was in prison. She was coordinating our 20-year high school reunion. And somebody who had read one of the books that I wrote or an article that I wrote was researching me. And that research led him to Carol. And when Carol learned that I was in prison, she wrote me a letter. And that letter led to me trying to court her from inside of a prison, visiting her inside of a prison, actually. And it took us 9 months of exchanging letters back and forth. But through those letters, I learned that the pen is mightier than the sword, and with a pen I could persuade people to do things. And I persuaded my the love of my life to not only be my friend and best advocate, but also to marry me. And we got married inside of a prison visiting room 20 years ago in June of 2003.
People should know that she followed you all over the country. As you were transferred from prison to prison, she would pick up and move and take her daughter from school to school just to be close to you. I mean, such dedication and love. And, people might think, what kind of person is this? And I just want our viewers to know, Etty and I met her. She is normal. She's educated. She is an amazing person. She's a nurse.
She comes from a very prominent family, all educated.
And we should also give kudos to you, Michael, that you put her through nursing school
while in prison.
Well, let's be clear. She put her. I earned the money.
Right.
She could support her, but she did.
Which is a whole other story.
It was a tremendous amount of work. Yeah, but it was a joint effort. We were partners from the beginning. And I mean, she came into my life at the right time. It was 2002, right after 9/11. And I got her letter, and it was the right time for me, because I think as a human being, we all long to be connected with our mate, with somebody. I think it is the word beshert correct?
Beshert, yes. Very good.
Yankees in the city.
Yankees in the city. You had to do it.
I had found my beshert, and I was in prison, and I couldn't be with her. But she was in Oregon, and I was in New Jersey. And by writing to her every day, we became very close. And she began typing manuscripts that I was writing, and we began working together. And it took, I think, 9 or 10 months before she came to visit me. But as soon as we spent time together after that long courtship through writing, we were really committed. And within a few months, she moved to New Jersey. And then, as I said, in June of 2003, we got married. And when we got married, we just set a plan that said, okay, I've got 10 more years to serve in prison. And we're going to use all the resources that I can create to help her so that she could be with me, and we could build our life together. And we started building this very unconventional life, even though we could never spend more time together than authorities would allow, and never have more affection than just holding each other's hand inside of a visiting room that is closely monitored and brightly lit rooms. But we cherished every minute, and it's what's made our marriage so rich. And I'm so grateful to her, because she's just been an amazing source of support for me for 20 years. And I feel as if I'm the most fortunate man alive because of her.
So beautiful. Before I ask you the next question, can you tell our viewers, I mean, Etty and I know, because we know your life from the book, but can you tell the viewers how you actually made money from prison?
I was just going to say
about that.
There's a lot of ways.
Well, we know, but
I'll tell you, I started making money after I got my college degrees, And the first efforts was through writing. So I was a writer, and I do little jobs for people or for publications. And through that little bit of money, I put together, I remember the first time I put together $2,000. There's a long story on that $2,000. I think it requires 2 chapters in the book, but I was writing for a friend of mine in prison. And that $2,000 in turn, I was able to turn it, fortunately, into a very fortunate investment in Yahoo at the very start of the internet. And then using margin and leverage, I leveraged that $2,000 up to a significant series of trades. So I made more than $1 million inside of a prison visiting room.
Amazing.
Just by wanting to be a part of the internet. And that was the only way I could be a part of it. I had no idea what the internet was other than what I read, but it was incredibly inspiring to me. And I used it every day. And by using it, I mean, I didn't have access to the internet, but I would watch CNBC, and I would read Investors Business Daily and Barron's and Wall Street Journal and all the magazines. And so I'd learn about the internet, and then I started investing in it and leveraging my way up.
And your sister would do the trades for you.
Yeah, I would have to coordinate it within the rules of the prison, which meant I couldn't execute the trade myself. So I'd call my sister every morning and tell her what I wanted to do. And I just kept buying and borrowing against the equity as it grew. And of course, at that time, at the start of the internet, those stocks were moving similarly to the way cryptocurrencies are moving right now, just so volatile and crazy. And you could leverage them. So I was.
That's a whole different lunch that we are going to go and pick on your brains right now. You know, I have to tell our audience that obviously I'm going to promote your book. I really think anyone should read it, even if you don't have anybody in prison. But what is amazing to me, as I was reading the book, you self-taught yourself, everything that you know about, the stock market. You got your bachelor's, you got your master's. If the prison was not so giving you such a hard time, you would have even gotten your PhD. You almost got your PhD.
And a law degree.
The law degree, but because of things the warden and
the mail.
Right. We are very angry. We are very angry about that.
Isn't that part of life, though? We're always working, and hopefully you're taking 3 or 4 steps forward, and then you have a setback, and then you keep going. And life is about perseverance and overcoming. And those were lessons that I learned from, as I said, people that have gone through much bigger struggles than I went through. They inspired me, and they taught me to live in the world as it exists. And the world as it exists is there's always going to be challenge. There's always going to be struggle, but yet there's always a way through. And I think that's a valuable lesson for all human beings. It's not really a prison story. It's a human story, because that's the story of life.
Hi.
I wanted to ask you, could you explain how mass incarceration is a big societal problem?
Yes, it is. I consider it to be one of the great social injustices of our time, not only because far too many people are serving sentences that are far too long, and there's no mechanism for people to work and earn their way to liberty, but it's the intergenerational cycles of problems that follow for the children of the incarcerated. It is also the lack of access to society when they finish serving their sentence. So a person comes out of prison and they'll find a job market that can be shut off. Well, while they're in prison, they don't have opportunities to learn. So they don't have opportunities, for example, to learn the internet or learn technology or even learn how to use a cell phone. These are tools that are taken away from people in prison. They lack, and I overcame it, and anybody can overcome it, but they make such huge hurdles that it's hard. And I consider it my job to try and build those bridges to help people over the hurdles. But there's a lack of opportunity for people in prison to prepare for success. Then when they come home, they find an unfriendly job market, unfriendly housing market, unfriendly banking market, unfriendly credit market. And it's enormously difficult for them to integrate with society. And so they suffer, their children suffer. And with everything closed off, sadly for many of them, it results in a return trip to prison that afflicts not only them, but their children. And I think we can do better as a society. And that's why I strive to change.
And you really had a plan for yourself from the moment you went in so that you would be ready monetarily when you exited prison. And you really accomplished that. I mean, not many people have that vision at such a young age that you said, I need to be ready and have money when I come out of prison. And you did that.
Yeah, it was very important for me to walk out of prison with enough money in the bank that I could live for a year without needing a job. And when I walked out, I had more than $100,000 in the bank, all that I earned while I was in prison.
Right. And we have to mention that you didn't do it for the money. You did it because you knew that if you don't have it, your likelihood is to go back into prison because you'll have to do illegal things to earn money. No, or
I think that's certainly a risk for a lot of people. I knew that I would never break the law, and I knew I didn't. It's not about money. You're right. It's not about money for me. It's about stability and being strong.
Right.
And Abraham Maslow wrote this great theory on the hierarchy of needs. And if you don't have basic needs met, it's hard to advance in life.
Right.
So I learned that I need to make sure that I understand the world even before I get to the world. And I walked into the world knowing or believing or living as if I am unemployable. So I have to create my own income streams. I have to create my own leads, my own deals, my own financing, everything. And that's why I work 7 days a week to try and overcome and build. And that drives me every day.
Wow. Even in the Bible, they said, if you don't have bread, you cannot study. Really, yeah. It's a verse, that unless you have the basic necessities, you will not be able to learn the Bible and do what you need to do as a religious person.
And we have to sow seeds all over. So, like I'm sowing seeds right now with the Yentas in the city, knowing that you've got a very powerful audience. And I want this audience to know that if a person works hard and if a person contributes and a person creates value, that person can overcome anything. And that's a very strong belief that I have. And I've made money and lost money and made money again. And I've lost liberty and I've gotten liberty. And it all centers around having that very principled way of living. And that's the way we can move forward. Wow.
I want to ask you, can you tell us a little bit about, I just have to mention, Michael is not Jewish. He looked at the Jewish people and their suffering in the Holocaust, and that inspired him. He's involved with the Olah Institute, which is an organization that is available to prisoners and their families to give them support, advocate, and fight for the prisoners' rights. The Olah Institute motto is no one alone, no one forgotten. You got involved. I want to ask you, can you tell us a little bit about the Olah Institute, and why did you feel that you wanted to get involved with them?
Sure. Well, Olah is interesting that I started learning about Olah many years ago. So when I started my journey in prison, they were just getting started in sending literature inside of the prisons. And I don't know who the rabbis were at that time, but later I started to have a lot of friends in prison that were Jewish. And so I'd get their newsletters and their magazines and I'd get to read them. And I was so impressed with how much work they would do to advocate for people. And it wasn't only for Jewish people, although I never worked to have them advocate for me. I was inspired by them, and I was always inspired by people who wanted to give back and do something with their helping people. And it was through that I've met people. In fact, this week I'm going to be meeting with Rabbi Boyarsky at the Olah Institute and several of his colleagues, and they have a national presence, and I'm going to be donating a lot of workbooks that I've written and literature that I write to try and help them help the people that they serve, because they need more literature. So I'm really enthusiastic about collaborating with Olah because I think they do amazing work. And I'm very grateful to Rabbi Boyarsky and the others who do so much work on behalf of people.
That's amazing.
In prison.
Wow.
That's amazing. Michael, you mentioned in your book, Earning Freedom, Conquering a 45-Year Prison Term, that you had the opportunity, as you said, to meet several white-collar crime executives. And one that you mentioned specifically in your book was Greg Reyes, the former CEO of Brocade Communications. This occurred while you were at Taft at the camp. I would like to just mention to our viewers that Reyes was pardoned by President Trump. Can you explain to our listeners how your friendship evolved and what it meant to the two of you to share what Reyes called his dark journey through prison?
Well, Greg is, like a lot of white collar people, they go to prison even though maybe their actions could have been handled civilly rather than criminally. I met him when it was at the darkest days of his life. He had been the CEO of a company that he built to more than $25 billion in market cap and has really introduced cloud computing to the world. But when I met him, he was really struggling and he gained a lot of weight and he was on the verge of losing his family, his liberty, his livelihood. And we became friends inside of a prison. And I made it my goal to try and help him like I did with many people. And through that course of that work, he got into great shape. He achieved goals that he wanted to achieve.
I bet he did if he was with you, because you like 10,000 miles in prison. I mean, like some astronomical.
If you Google Greg Reyes and Michael Santos, you'll see a big article in Business Insider which shows him after we ran a marathon together.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
He lost like 100 pounds in there and got ripped.
Wow. I didn't know that.
Michael needs to train us, Eti.
Right, Michael. We need to lose 100 pounds.
You want to add trainer to your resume?
I just strive to live a life that's full of meaning and contribution wherever I am. And I was fortunate to be with Greg, and he became a very close friend of mine, a mentor of mine, a sponsor of our nonprofit. And he's still a good friend and a mentor to me.
Did you write his biography?
Yeah, we wrote it together. So that was one of the ways that I earned money while I was in prison, is I would meet people like Greg, and I would say, as I interview them or talk with them, I would say, you need to write your book. And then like all of them would always tell me, they'd say, well, I'm not a very good writer. And I would say, well, I'm not a very good writer either, but I write a lot of books. They'd laugh and they'd say to me, well, what do you charge to write a book? And I would tell them, well, do you have a secretary? And they said, yes. And I said, well, what do you pay your secretary? I said, and half of them didn't even know. They said, I don't know, $20 an hour or something like that. I said, well, can she write your book? And they'd say, no. I said, well, then we know it's more than $20 an hour. And that's how I got started. And then I would always just leave it to them. I would say, let me write for you. And if you like it, you've hired thousands of people, you pay. And it was through that work that I was able to earn a living and provide those resources to my wife. And because of that, she's now a master's educated nurse and doing great things. And I'm so proud of her. But there was all a joint effort.
So I want to tell our listeners, Michael lectures at Berkeley and at Stanford. At the later time, we will
later this spring, by the way.
I'm going to come and see you. I told you I'm going to come. We are going to be.
Yeah, I just got the invitation, so I'll let you know the date.
Oh, perfect. And we will advertise it for our viewers.
Yeah, it's free. Lecture at Wheeler Hall in Berkeley.
Oh, wow. I'll come with my daughter.
Okay.
And your Yenta.
And the Yentas will cheer.
That's great.
Michael, we want to thank you so much for joining us today. You took the worst thing that could ever happen to anyone in their life during their 20s. You were separated from your family and community. You were locked and felt helpless against the whims of prison guards and unfamiliar prison system. You learned on your own how to navigate the prison system. Many in your situation will be angry, depressed, and will give up on life. You took the cards that were dealt to you and you triumphed. Your ability to change and transform yourself touched our hearts and lifted our souls. Really, they really did. And what started as a connection for an interview on Yentas in the City turned into working together towards prison reform and a great friendship, and we know that it's a start of a very long friendship. The Yentes are very honored to call you a friend. We can't get over your journey. Thank you again for taking the time out of your very, very busy schedule to speak to us today. And we can't wait to see you next week when you come back to LA. We would like to thank our followers, our listeners. Please remember, you can always follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Yentes in the City. You can also write dearyentes@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you and answer your letters on our weekly advice column. We would like to thank our sponsors, Soft Smart System International and Conquest Realty Investments. We really hope you enjoyed this episode. We have a lot more coming. This is Etty Elkis and Karen Cohen. We are the Yentes. Remember to always be the Ruth in the room and do the right thing. Stay safe. We will have a link to Michael Santos' book when we put this episode up on our YouTube channel. We really recommend for anyone to read it. Also, we have to mention that if you have anyone in your family or friends that for some reason they're in court or they're about to go into prison, Michael has a firm that will help you navigate the system and help them.
Professors.com.
Professors.com, and all my partners are Jewish.
And all the partners are Jewish. Let's remember that. Thank you, Michael, so much. It was really an honor to have you. Stay tuned after. We want to speak to you a little bit more. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Michael.